Now This and the Appeal. I'm Alana Sivan. Nearly a year ago, officials in Albuquerque announced that the city was creating a third department of first responders that would provide alternative services to the police department and the fire department. Now, this new agency, the Albuquerque Community Safety Department, was set up to be staffed by civilians who would take a public health approach to public safety, with a specific focus on issues related to mental health, housing and homelessness, violence prevention, and drug use. Now, this plan is part of a growing movement throughout the country to shift resources away from the one-size-fits-all, police-first approach to public safety and towards things that actually keep people safe. Because as we've seen in so many cities across the country, law enforcement spends a huge amount of its time responding to things that don't require a gun and a badge, things like mental health, homelessness, and other quality of life issues that officers are actually pretty bad at handling. In so many of these instances, the presence of an armed police officer actually creates more harm. And this is actually true when we see that 1/4 of all people killed by police are experiencing problems related to mental illness. And in even better case scenarios, where cops may not physically harm a person in crisis, a law enforcement response is more likely to lead to arrest and incarceration, all of which only further destabilizes people who are vulnerable. And so cities across the nation are recognizing this need for a police response or for a non-police response. In Albuquerque, the city is empowering trained civilian specialists to handle many of the issues that currently fall to police. This new department, the Albuquerque Community Safety Department, or ACS, is training social workers who will be dispatched through 911 whenever it's determined that a community safety response would be more appropriate than a paramedic, firefighter, or armed police officer. And Albuquerque Mayor Tim Keller recently announced the hiring of 2 new directors for ACS, and the city appears on track to roll out its new slate of services later this year. For more on the Albuquerque Community Safety Department, I am joined now by the department's coordinator, Mariela Ruiz Angel, and Baron Jones, a senior policy strategist for the ACLU of New Mexico. Thank you both so much for being here today. Mariela, I'd love to start with you. Talk to us about the past year of work and where things stand right now. I know there have been some pretty promising developments, so let's talk a little bit about that.
Well, let's talk about 2020, right? Albuquerque has been notorious amongst other cities across the nation in which have had incidents of police brutality, excessive force, and ultimately criminalization of people who are experiencing mental health and behavioral health and poverty issues. And I will say that in defense of police, I think that we have tasked them historically to not just be violence and protectors and people who are really trying to kind of be that guardianship, but to also then be the social worker and the clinician who helps diagnose and the person who gets people to hospitals. And the reality is that it's not a good fit for that type of work, right? It's a difficult situation to be an enforcer and then try to then be an advocate and a connector on the complete opposite side. And so we have, for the last 3 years under this administration, we have been concentrating on how do we intervene, how do we do the restorative justice that needs to happen. And we've had lots of different pilots that have been very successful, but nothing that could actually make a huge difference in the issues that we had in Albuquerque. And so George Floyd, it really, that incident and that unrest within our nation pushed Albuquerque into an entire department. I think we were already on the road to this, but never at this level. And so, although I think in hindsight, we may have not created a department versus a program, it's actually been one of the best ideas and the best solutions to implementing something so new and radical, right? It doesn't feel radical for social workers and behavioral health specialists, but it's definitely radical for a lot of community and even for our police and fire departments. And so I think that we're in an amazing spot. We are very close to implementation. We will be bringing on folks. You know, I just had an amazing interview with the community, and they're like, what kind of individuals are you looking for? And I gave an example that I don't normally use, but I'm looking for the person that when you're at the grocery store and somebody, you know, you start to have a connection with somebody and you're talking to them because you're waiting in line, and all of a sudden they start to tell you their deepest, darkest secrets, right? Their issues that they just had that morning. And you actually engage and you actually listen and you actually maybe even think that you can provide some sort of solution. That's the person we're looking for, the individual who is a compassionate and good listener and who's just willing to want to help at that moment. We are not an enforcement department, and we want to make sure that we are connecting people to services and long-term care. We are also not doing case management, so a big piece of this is I think we have amazing partners, and we do have we have great partners, and we also have a collective amongst Albuquerque and New Mexico, and who are working together to kind of really tackle on the continuum of care that needs to happen and probably needs to be better in general. I think nationwide we need to kind of tackle this on a little bit more strategically, but the reality is we're helping to be that catalyst, and we're those frontliners so that we can pull police away for those petty misdemeanors and things that, again, right, we saw an increase in theft, and some of it, sure, can we say that some of it was was a habitual thing. Some of it had underlying issues with addiction. Some of it had underlying issues of survival to feed their children. And so we have to stop criminalizing people in poverty. We have to start looking at the bigger issues and really think about how can we stop this and not just punish somebody for it who then potentially might go back out and do it again.
You know, I really like your point about, you know, how the folks we want responding to these sorts of situations are people who are problem solvers, as opposed to, you know, people who are ready with a punitive response. And I think that this is something that jurisdictions have realized across the country, and that's something I've mentioned at the top. So Baron, I would love for you to jump in here, because I know that Albuquerque's police department has a really sordid history when it comes to its handling of some of those issues. So can you talk a little bit about where they failed over the years and why community organizers felt it was so necessary to shift away from this police first response?
Yes, through the years, dating back, actually decades, the Albuquerque Police Department had a vast problem of harming people they were sent to help, and so I think, and we've seen that prior to George Floyd, that the city of Albuquerque would respond to calls for people wanting welfare checks, and folks would end up dead, right? And this led to the department, being put under a Department of Justice consent decree, and because the Department of Justice found that there was a pattern and practice of civil rights violations within the realm of use of force and things like that. And so since 2014, the very, very public killing of James Boyd and the foothills of Albuquerque. James Boyd was a man living with mental health issues and housing security issues, and someone called the police because it was a quality of life crime. He was camping on public land, and when he his death came on the heels of the Department of Justice issuing the findings letter, right? And a few months later, we entered into the consent decree. And 6 years later, right now, what we see is that there is a issue within the department when it comes to disciplining, officers for wrongdoing and misconduct. So, we see the creation of the Albuquerque Community Safety Program. For some reason, I have a hard time saying that. We see this as a good step in a good step in the right direction to lessening the role of law enforcement, right? I mean, I think that's key when it comes to protecting our communities. When we lessen the role, as the Albuquerque Community Safety Department is designed to do, we'll stop setting officers up for failure. Because as Mariella pointed out, we are asking our law enforcement officers and Albuquerque and across the state to just do too much, right? Just do too much. They can't be social workers and they can't be, service providers, right? So this department, we see that as a wonderful segue to addressing that.
So when we talk about some of those services that you're discussing that are being taken away from the police, Maria, I'd love to hear from you about all of the different services contained within ACS and to sort of expand on that. Which ones are you prioritizing and how are those teams being assembled and put together?
So we're looking at this versus trying to say we're going to go out to this call or this dispatch code. The reality is we think that we can go out to lots of calls. What it needs to be is that instead of, right, it's a qualification process that allows us to understand the risk and what kind of other factors might be involved, right? It could be that we might need to do some sort of co-response where we might take out, it might be that we might need to have a firefighter with us because there might be an underlying health issue that we're going to interact with, right? So we need to have a paramedic. So I think that's what we're really trying to figure out is more so we truly believe that we can go out to those welfare checks. We believe that we can even go out to situations with people who are experienced domestic violence, right? Maybe it's not in that very moment because those tend to be one of our most dangerous types of calls, but how do we come in afterwards? How do we do follow-up afterwards to really help get people connected to services and safety plans, right? There are so many calls that we get around even people who, surprisingly enough, we get a lot of calls from constituents who probably just need to also be educated on, what actually, like that people who are panhandling and that those experiencing homelessness are not dangerous. I'm not going to say that as a general, right? But the reality is that we go out there day after day and do street outreach and have never had a real horrible interaction. And a lot of partners would say that. And it's understanding when to pull back, right? It's using that intuition and using your skills to know when you might be escalating or when somebody's already hit a point where they might not be able to have de-escalation. So I think we're going to really try to push as hard as we can with as many calls as we possibly can, given the risk factors, right? Is there a gun that's visual that you can see at that moment, right? Is there something so specific that we might potentially be walking into something that we're not going to be prepared for? Similarly, right? It's about the right response at the right time. I don't want to send out social workers to a SWAT situation. It's probably not a good, that's just not our expertise. But could we potentially go in afterwards? There are people who have bystanders who have then experienced trauma, people who have family who have been involved in homicides. How do we start to normalize how to do work in a trauma-informed way that we're not going to add more, but that we're relieving more, and that we're trying to really understand root issues. And so we're still working through a lot. We don't actually anticipate, again, to take on too much too fast. We want to grow at a steady pace, and we also want to be able to be really good at certain things. So we will continue to push our police departments and our fire departments. I think most folks that that we're working with are very open and willing, but there's a little bit of fear, I think. And again, for us, our social workers and people who have been doing this kind of work for years, I think it's really just a matter of almost demonstrating that this can be done in a different way and that we can have people walk away safely and have a really good experience, versus something, again, like Barron mentioned, right? A situation like James Boyd or George Floyd. Like, it doesn't have to go down like that. So we will be, again, going out to multiple types of different calls, but ideally, we want to make sure that we're going out to the calls in which we do see people who tend to get hurt the most because of escalation, or because there is sometimes underlying issues around race and biases. So we need to figure out how to engage in a deeper way. But to begin, we also want to make sure that we get people comfortable with the idea of this new department as well.
So talk to us about how these teams would be dispatched. What will the screening process look like through 911?
So we will work through our 911 dispatch, our 242 cops, and our 311 as it is right now. These folks already have a ton of experience and training in identifying issues that probably have some underlying behavioral health. We are talking about some additional training that probably needs to happen, though. They will then qualify it, as they currently do, to say, right, what is the situation? Where are you at? Is there anybody hurt? Is there anybody that might be threatening? And then at that point, it breaks off, right? It allows for that tree to then say, okay, this has all been cleared. Let's go ahead and we will send out 2 responders at all times. Just because we also want to make sure that people are safe, and if anything happens, we have someone who can potentially call for backup. But the reality is that we want to try to get away from calling police or fire when we possibly can for all calls. So again, if we get to the situation, we will be dispatched out, get to a situation, and if all goes well, we will work with that individual and then do follow-up, right? Where there's opportunity, we want to make sure that the connection that we've made is actually a purposeful and fulfilled connection. Now, we can't guarantee that everybody is going to want to have the intervention that we've connected them to, but at least that they got through to somebody who can potentially give them options. And then, but the second piece, right, let's say we get out to a scene and maybe we start walking up to the house and we realize this sounds like it could be potentially something way out of, right? And maybe it has, as we pull up the system, we realize this house potentially also has a history of actual like physical violence, or, maybe has guns. Like, we'll be able to determine, do we need to go in? Do we need to check out? Do we need to try to pull them out of the house? Let's assess the situation. And then if we do need to bring in, again, folks who can help with making sure that we're clear, then that will happen. But again, our primary focus is to try to do everything as much as we can without law enforcement.
Barron, talk to us about how you anticipate some of these responses working on the ground. Can you give us some real world examples of how this would differ from sort of traditional police responses in Albuquerque?
Yeah. I think I think this could play out in a way where a person who's experienced housing insecurity or substance abuse issues will probably get the help it needs. But there's also the danger that because what's going on now? There's a couple things here, right? There's sort of a dearth of mental health and substance abuse services in Albuquerque. So, first of all, I think in order for this to work correctly and really sort of get at what the intent is to maybe invest a bit more into the program and to shoring up those services amongst the continuum that Mariella had mentioned. Because right now we know in the state of New Mexico, we've never recovered from a situation where many of our mental health providers were, their contracts were ended for some reasons by a previous governor, and they were and outside out-of-state providers were kicked out of the state. So the state, Albuquerque has never really recovered from that. So in order for this department to really, live up to its potential, we would have to do some more investments in the street. I think right now there could be the unfortunately, right, there's a phenomenon going on in Albuquerque where one department of the city is undergoing but encampment sweeps and things like that, and the city is sort of drafting policies to on how they would you know go about those encampment suites. But I think the department is starting off with there's going to be some trust issues, right, between members of our unhoused and unsheltered communities, between folks, members of the city, because of what's going on now in present day. So I think this could, but overall, I truly believe that if the resources were properly, if the department is properly resourced, we could go a long way to lessen that interaction between armed law enforcement officials and members of the community who are living with quality of life issues. If that makes any sense.
To bring that up, because I think we've seen a lot of concern about, for example, the funding that has been allocated for ACS. The budget last year gave just 1/3 of what Mayor Keller had requested, which was the 2.5 million of the requested 7.5 million. So do you think that this budget will limit the ability of ACS to provide public safety? And are you hopeful that you can get more funding in the future? So Mariela, I'll turn to you on this. Or actually, I will start with you, Baron, and then Mariela, feel free to jump in.
Okay, yeah, I would. I think that the current budget right now, I think that it probably because we're in a budget process right now in the city of Albuquerque, and there's a proposed, I think, $7.3 million budget, right? But this department is going to require a heavy lift to really help identify and resource those wraparound services that we need. And I know there's a call to take money away from police budgets across the nation. But when you look at ours in our city, that proposed budget has, where are my notes at? I think it has something like it's where is it at? I'm so sorry for not having this on my fingertips. It's a 23.9 increase from last year's budget, up $43 million, right? That's so the proposed budget for the Albuquerque Police Department is $223 million. I would love to see, some more of that money put into Mariela and her team's projects, so we can really just make sure that department has the resources. Because we know that things start off strong, right? And if enough attention isn't given in the onset, it could lead to fizzling down the road. So that's what I would like to see. And thank you.
So Mariela, do you think that what are your thoughts on this? Do you think that you'll be able to provide public safety, and particularly with the budget that is being presented?
Yeah, no, Baron's 100% right when it comes to the disparity, when you see such a millions upon millions of dollars going into police and fire departments, and then a couple million for ACS. Originally we did have a pretty big budget for our first year, and unfortunately, I think we came to there was some rub, because some of it was going to be transference of employees that may not have been a good fit for this department, and so it ended up being in a situation where we're really trying to create something very purposeful and very well thought out. I looked at the $2 million as potentially seed money. What it allowed for us to do was to continue to strategically plan how we plan to grow in the next, hopefully, 4 years. We also are in an election year. So I think that we, from a 2-point up to a 7-point, and then potentially also, we've also put in request for money for a actual building that will be dedicated to this department and be built. I think that we will hopefully, with the justification, this is my hope, these are my visions, my hopes for this department, but as we start to see the numbers right, and what we've been able to do through ACS, I think every year we will see huge pulls from potentially other departments or potentially the police department. I mean, it's the reality of what I think a lot of cities nationwide are trying to figure out, right? If we're not going to send police officers to as many of these types of calls, then why wouldn't we go? Why wouldn't it go to the folks who are? So it's a lot. I know it's a lot more complicated, and it feels like a very simple justification, but we are in a space and the city is in a place where we also have a ton of positions, and nationwide, I think we're going to see this, right? Police officers are retiring early, they're leaving, and it is what it is. And so I think that we need to then refocus and reallocate where we need to reallocate. So I think that we'll continue to look at that budget process. Again, we're not in a place where even if we were given $200 million, I don't know if we could spend that all in a year, because we're still in this process of trying to make sure that people are that we have the right the training processes, right? That we have the proper SOPs and that make us essential, right? There are SOPs that pretty much say if the police is there first, they're the ones that engage and you take secondary. Like, how do we start to switch some of that policy? How do we create policy that doesn't really talk about property, but actually starts talking about the human person involved, right? It's going to take some time. And so as much as I was also wanting to have a huge budget in our first year, given COVID and everything that's gone on in Albuquerque, I think that we have a good foundation going into FY22. And I do believe the jump will help us, but we're going to continue to grow. And we expect, our hope is that by the next 4 years, this department has maybe 300 or 400 people running around. It's going to be, it's the vision of the mayor, it's the vision of our administration. And to be honest, I think it's what the community really needs and wants, right? Through an engagement event, we had a very lengthy community engagement event, because Barron's right. We already have so much mistrust with community. It's going to take a whole rebuild. And the minute when somebody hurts that trust, we will have to rebuild it again. So we don't want to get to that place. We want to make sure people are trained, they understand the vision, they're a good fit, and that we have the policies in place so that we actually do have teeth. And to Barron's point, my job and my team's job will be to figure out, how do we continue a department like this, regardless of who's mayor? Because that is sometimes a game changer when we talk about the politics in these types of new initiatives and new types of programs.
You know, when you talk about this shift away from policy, it's interesting, because policy isn't just, you know, the directives that are set out. It's also it's money, it's the budget, and so it's interesting to me to hear that this debate is also happening while the police department is asking for a 5% increase in its budget to focus on things like community policing, quote, tackling cycles of violence. So it seems to me, though, that when we're talking about a shifting of priorities, it's not just, like you said, sort of shifting the ways that people are responding, but also shifting budgets, you know, making it so that, no, we're not putting money into community policing, we're instead putting it into these sorts of programs. So wondering what each of your thoughts are on that. Barron, just curious to hear your thoughts as to whether or not that makes more sense in terms of this budget shift as opposed to sort of investing into things like community policing.
Oh yeah, 100%. You know, I agree. You know, there's, when it comes to law enforcement, money is no object, but when it comes to humanity, you know, we have to pull back the budget. We see this time and time again at all levels of government. So yeah, I agree. You know, part of doing this work and healing communities is investing in communities, and when, you know, I appreciate the you know, the budget for the ACS this year, and as Mariella said, is something that will grow. But in order to there's myriad issues that fail people here in Albuquerque and across the nation. And until we start to shore up those systems with investments and pull away from systems that we know have caused harm, right? That many see as harm causing systems, that we can go a long way to sort of get at what we need to heal our communities. And so, yeah, I agree 100%. And this is not, and this thinking is not anti-police or anything. It's just that, for years and years we based our system of what is it, public safety on punitive measures designed to, really, designed to take away from families instead of add to them. So I think, you know, finding ways, creative ways to move that money out of current systems would do a good job, and also really sort of educate the public, as Mariella mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, to realize that all these things aren't police issues, and really focus on reducing that role. Because I think, if Mariella's program department is successful, you don't need 1,000 more police officers patrolling the streets, right? So it just sort of works within one another.
Well, I want to thank you both for being with us today and for all of the great work that you're doing in Albuquerque. And best of luck to both of you.
Thank you all so much. Thank you.
So it's really interesting to hear through this segment, and really through a lot of the segments we've done here on the Appeal Live, the unique ways that different jurisdictions are looking to create public safety. I mean, we have for so long relied on traditional policing models, despite the fact that they just don't work for the majority of the things that they respond to. We know that a large portion right now of police's responsibilities are responding to things that don't really need police. We know that somewhere between up to 96% of police responsibilities, a lot of studies suggest, are going towards nonviolent incidents. And we've seen that in those nonviolent incidents, they respond and often create harm. We saw this with James Boyd. We saw this with, across the country with so many of the people who have been harmed by police violence. And we see why that is. I mean, Mariela talked a lot about how police aren't social workers and they can't be expected to be social workers. That's not what they understand their job to be. And so by creating this alternative department, we're actually responding to people's needs, and we're actually treating people like people who have problems that sometimes require a collaborative solution and require holistic public health solutions, not state-sanctioned violence. So that is all the time we have for today. Thank you for joining us here in the Appeal Live. You can continue to follow us on Twitter and Facebook for the latest news. We'll see you next time.